There's something about a man who refuses to blink when death stares him in the face that makes you wonder what he knows that you don't. This isn't about some Hollywood hero with plot armor or a lucky charm hanging around his neck. This is about Rajesh, a name we're using to protect him, though protection seems almost redundant now, given what happened. Rajesh lived in a place where saying the wrong name could get you killed, where believing the wrong thing could cost you everything, and where loving the wrong God meant your family might wake up one morning to find you simply gone. But Rajesh kept talking, kept believing, kept loving that God anyway. What makes a man do that? What makes someone stand in the marketplace on a humid Tuesday afternoon, sweat running down his back, dust coating his sandals, and tell strangers about a Jewish carpenter who died 2,000 years ago? You'd have to ask Rajesh, but he's not easy to reach these days. Not because he's hiding, though maybe he should be, but because after what happened, everyone wants a piece of his story. Everyone wants to know how you survived something that should have ended you. How you walk away from an execution that already began. The town where Rajesh lived doesn't appear on tourist maps. It's one of those places that exists in the gaps between official records and international attention, where the heat shimmers off corrugated metal roofs and the call to prayer echoes 5 times daily across neighborhoods that smell like cardamom and diesel fuel. Children kick deflated soccer balls through narrow streets while their mothers hang laundry on lines strung between crumbling concrete walls painted in faded advertisements for cell phone companies and soft drinks. It's beautiful in the way forgotten places often are, carrying a kind of dignity that poverty can't quite erase, but it's also dangerous in ways that don't make the evening news. Rajesh wasn't always the kind of man who attracted danger. He used to blend in, actually. Used to be the guy you wouldn't notice in a crowd, the one who nodded politely when religious conversation started and then excused himself to check on his vegetable stand or help his wife with the children. He sold tomatoes and okra and those small bitter eggplants that taste better than they look. He was good at it, too. Had regular customers, fair prices, a reputation for honest scales. But then something shifted. Something got inside him that wouldn't stay quiet, wouldn't stay hidden, wouldn't let him go back to being invisible. It started small, the way these things usually do. A conversation with a stranger at the market, a book someone left on a bench that he picked up out of curiosity, a persistent thought that followed him home at night and waited for him in the morning. Rajesh began asking questions that his community didn't appreciate. Questions about certainty and grace, about who decides who's worthy and whether mercy has limits. His wife noticed first, the way wives do. She saw him reading by lamplight when he should have been sleeping, saw him distracted during meals, saw something burning behind his eyes that hadn't been there before. When Rajesh finally told her what he'd decided to believe, she wept. Not because she didn't love him. She loved him desperately, but because she knew what this meant. In their neighborhood, in their family, in their entire social world, this kind of decision didn't lead to awkward dinners and uncomfortable silences. It led to isolation first, then threats, and then something worse. She begged him to keep it private, to believe whatever he wanted, inside his own head, but not to speak it out loud. But that's the problem with certain kinds of fire. They don't burn quietly. They demand fuel. They demand air. They demand to be seen. So Rajesh started talking. At first, just to a few people, tentative conversations in low voices behind his vegetable stand when business was slow. He'd tell them about what he'd discovered, about a God who didn't require perfection before offering love, about a sacrifice that was supposed to settle every debt. Most people walked away. Some laughed. A few lingered, leaning against the wooden frame of his stall, asking careful questions while pretending to examine his produce. One or two even came back later, alone, after dark, wanting to hear more. The community noticed. How could they not? In a place where everyone watches everyone, where the architecture of daily life is built on observation and reputation, A man changing his religion is like a stone thrown into still water. The ripples spread, whether you want them to or not. First came the whispers, then the open questions, then the visits from religious leaders who wanted to correct his thinking. Rajesh listened politely to each delegation, offered them tea, and then quietly explained that he couldn't go back. Not wouldn't, couldn't. Like a man who's seen color for the first time, trying to convince himself the world is actually black and white. His business suffered. Regular customers stopped coming. The landlord who rented him his market space started hinting that maybe Rajesh should consider selling vegetables somewhere else. His children came home from school with stories about being pushed, being called names, being told his father was leading the family to hell. His wife stopped weeping and started planning, mentally cataloging which relatives might take them in, which neighbors might help them disappear if things got truly dangerous. But Rajesh kept talking. Here's what you need to understand about the kind of danger Rajesh faced. It wasn't abstract. It wasn't theoretical. In the country where he lived, there were laws on the books that made it illegal to convert someone from one religion to another. They called them anti-conversion laws, framed them as protecting people from coercion and manipulation. But in practice, these laws created a machinery of intimidation where simply sharing your faith could land you in court, or, if you were unlucky, in a hospital or a grave. Every year, people like Rajesh disappeared. Every year, churches were burned. Every year, families were torn apart by mobs who believed they were defending something sacred by destroying something they feared. Rajesh knew all this. He wasn't naive. He'd seen the reports, heard the stories, attended the quiet funerals where questions about what really happened were answered with nervous silence. But knowledge and fear, it turns out, aren't always enough to stop a man who believes he's found something worth dying for. That's either the most beautiful thing about human beings or the most terrifying, depending on your perspective. Maybe it's both. About 6 months after Rajesh first started openly sharing his new faith, the threats became specific. Notes left at his vegetable stand, messages delivered through mutual acquaintances, a brick through his window one night that sent glass skittering across the floor where his children slept. The message was clear. Stop talking or face consequences. Rajesh's wife pleaded with him to listen, to think about their family, to consider whether God really required him to be quite so vocal about what he believed. Other believers in the area, part of a small underground network of converts and house churches, urged caution. They knew what happened to people who pushed too hard, who made themselves too visible. But Rajesh had this conviction that settled in his bones like an anchor. He'd tell people, quietly but firmly, that if God had reached down into his life and pulled him out of despair, and that's what it had felt like to him, like being pulled from deep water where he'd been drowning without realizing it, then how could he stay silent? How could he know about a life raft and not tell other people who were drowning? It wasn't courage, he'd insist. It was just impossible to do anything else. Like a man who's finally tasted food after years of starvation, not to mention that he's found bread.
The day it happened started ordinary. That's what survivors of extraordinary things always say, isn't it? That morning felt like every other morning. Rajesh woke before dawn, said his prayers while his family still slept, dressed in his usual clothes, simple cotton shirt, loose pants, sandals that had seen better days. He drank tea that his wife prepared, kissed his children's foreheads, and headed to the market to set up his stall. The sun was just beginning to push back the darkness, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange that looked too beautiful for what was coming. At the market, Rajesh arranged his vegetables the way he always did, tomatoes in front because they attracted customers, eggplants to the side, okra in baskets that he'd woven himself during slow evenings. He greeted the other vendors, men and women he'd known for years, though their responses had grown cooler lately, more guarded. He understood. They had families too. They had reputations to protect. Association with him had become dangerous, and he didn't blame them for keeping their distance. Around mid-morning, a group of young men appeared at the market. Rajesh noticed them immediately because they moved differently than shoppers, purposeful, watching him, forming a loose semicircle that gradually tightened. He recognized a few of them, hotheads from the neighborhood known for starting fights and carrying grudges. They'd been among those sending threats, spreading rumors, calling him a traitor to his community and his ancestors. Rajesh felt his heartbeat quicken but forced himself to stay calm, to keep arranging his vegetables, to pretend this was normal. They started with questions, loud enough for everyone to hear. Why was he still here? Didn't he understand he wasn't welcome? Did he think he could disrespect their faith and face no consequences? Rajesh answered softly, trying not to escalate, explaining that he meant no disrespect, that he simply wanted to live according to his own conscience. But soft answers don't always turn away wrath. Sometimes they're interpreted as weakness, as an invitation to push harder. The crowd grew. More young men arrived, and behind them older men who watched with arms crossed, neither joining nor intervening. Rajesh's fellow vendors began packing up their goods, creating distance, not wanting to be nearby for whatever was about to happen. The market, so busy just minutes before, started emptying like water draining from a sink. Rajesh stood behind his vegetable stand, alone now, watching the semicircle become a full circle, watching angry faces multiply, listening to the shouts grow louder and more specific about what they planned to do to him. Then someone said the word that changed everything. Example. They needed to make an example of him so others would know what happened to traitors, to apostates, to people who thought they could abandon their community and face no consequences. And that's when Rajesh saw the gun. The thing about seeing a gun pointed at your chest is that time doesn't actually slow down. That's a movie lie. But your perception sharpens in a way that feels almost supernatural. Rajesh noticed everything in that moment. The way the middle caught the sunlight, the slight tremor in the hand holding it, the smell of diesel and rotting vegetables, and his own fear, sudden and acidic, the taste of copper in his mouth like he'd bitten his tongue. Every detail crystallized with the kind of clarity you can't achieve through meditation or mindfulness exercises or any deliberate practice. This was involuntary focus, the body's final gift before potential annihilation, a chance to see the world one last time with perfect attention. The young man holding the gun was maybe 22, 23 years old. Rajesh didn't know his name, but recognized his face from the neighborhood. Someone's son. Someone's brother. A kid who probably helped his mother carry groceries and played cricket with his friends and had dreams about the future. But right now, in this moment, he was something else. He was the instrument of collective rage, the embodiment of community judgment, the answer to the question of what happens when you cross certain lines. His hand shook not from fear, but from adrenaline, from the electric thrill of having power over life and death, from knowing that everyone was watching and that what happened next would define him. He opened his mouth to speak, to say what he wasn't sure, but before words could form, the young man squeezed the trigger. The sound was impossibly loud in the suddenly silent market, a crack that echoed off concrete walls and corrugated metal roofs and made birds explode from nearby trees in a panic of wings. Rajesh flinched, a full-body jerk backward, waiting for the impact, waiting for pain, waiting for darkness. But nothing came. No impact, no pain, no darkness. Just the echo of the gunshot fading, and a strange suspended moment where everyone, shooter, target, crowd, stood frozen in confusion.
The young man looked at his gun like it had betrayed him, checked it, aimed again, fired. Another crack, another echo, another impossible nothing. Rajesh was still standing, still breathing, still staring at the gun that should have ended him twice now, but hadn't. He looked down at his chest, patting it with trembling hands, searching for wounds, for blood, for some explanation. His shirt was intact, his skin unbroken, not even a scratch. The young man with the gun was screaming now, shouting that something was wrong, that it wasn't working. But others in the crowd yelled back that they'd heard the shots, seen the muzzle flash, watched bullets leave the barrel. A third shot. Point-blank range now. The gun so close Rajesh could have reached out and touched it. The crowd behind him scattered, not wanting to be hit by a bullet passing through Rajesh's body. But again, nothing. The sound, the smoke, the flash, all present. The result, completely absent. Rajesh stood there like a man behind invisible glass, something between him and death that no one could see but everyone could sense. The young man's hand was really shaking now, not from adrenaline but from something closer to terror. This wasn't how this was supposed to go. This wasn't natural. This wasn't explainable. He fired again, and again. The gun worked. It was firing, expelling bullets that should have torn through flesh and bone and vital organs. But Rajesh remained standing, intact, his face a mixture of shock and something else, something that looked almost like recognition, like he was piecing together an explanation that defied every natural law but somehow made perfect sense to him. In the crowd, someone shouted that this was black magic, that Rajesh must be protected by evil spirits. Someone else yelled that the gun was defective, though how a defective gun fires multiple times without hitting a target 10 feet away made no sense. A woman's voice, high and frightened, said the words that everyone was thinking but no one wanted to speak. God is protecting him. And that statement hung in the air like smoke, like incense, like a challenge to everything they thought they understood about how the world worked and whose God held real power. The young man with the gun looked at his hands, at the weapon they held, then at Rajesh. And in his eyes, Rajesh saw something shift. The rage was still there, but underneath it something older and more primal. Doubt. Not doubt about whether to kill Rajesh, but doubt about whether it was even possible. Whether he was fighting against something bigger than a vegetable seller who changed religions. Whether he'd walked into a story that was already written and his role was just to demonstrate who wrote it. He fired twice more in rapid succession, desperate now, wanting to prove this was normal, that bullets worked, that a man could be killed if you just pulled the trigger enough times. But Rajesh didn't fall, didn't bleed, didn't die. He just stood there, his hands half raised in a gesture that was part surrender, part wonder, his eyes wide and wet with tears that hadn't started falling yet, his mouth open in a shape that might have been a prayer, or might have just been raw astonishment. Then the gun clicked empty. 7 shots, maybe 8, Rajesh lost count, all fired at close range, all aimed at center mass where every training manual and crime movie says to aim if you want to be sure. 7 or 8 opportunities for physics to work the way it always works, for metal to penetrate flesh, for momentum to transfer from bullet to body. 7 or 8 chances for Rajesh to become a statistic, a cautionary tale, another name on a list of persecuted believers. But instead, he was standing there, intact, breathing hard, looking down at himself like he expected to finally find the wounds and was continuously surprised by their absence. The crowd began to fragment. Some people backed away slowly, hands raised as if to ward off whatever invisible force had just intervened. Others pressed closer, needing to see, needing to understand, needing to check Rajesh's body for evidence of trickery or illusion. They patted his chest, grabbed his shirt, turned him around to check his back. Nothing. Not a mark, not a scratch, not even a bruise. One older man, braver or more skeptical than the rest, took the gun from the young man's trembling hands and examined it. It was fine. It worked. It had fired. The barrel was still hot. Empty cartridges littered the ground at the young man's feet, brass evidence that something had definitely happened, even if the expected result had somehow been suspended. Someone ran to get the police. Someone else ran to get religious leaders.
someone ran to get Rajesh's wife, who arrived 15 minutes later, pushing through the crowd with terror written all over her face, certain she was about to see her husband's body, certain this was the day she'd been dreading since he first opened his mouth about his new faith. But instead, she found him standing in the center of a crowd that looked at him like a ghost or a saint or a sign, his face wet with tears now, his hands still patting his own chest like he couldn't quite believe it, like he needed constant confirmation that he was still solid, still present, still alive. He told her, "They shot me. They shot me so many times. But I'm still here. God." He couldn't finish the sentence. Didn't need to. She understood. She saw the empty cartridges, saw the gun, saw the crowd's faces, saw her husband standing whole when he should have been bleeding out on the dirty market floor. She grabbed him, held him, whispered prayers into his shoulder that mixed thanksgiving with terror. Because if God had protected him this time, what did that mean for next time? Did miracles come with warranties? Did divine intervention establish precedent? The police arrived confused and skeptical, taking statements that made no sense, examining a crime scene where the crime had somehow failed to materialize. They arrested the young man with the gun, that part at least was straightforward, and questioned Rajesh, who could only tell them the truth, which sounded like fiction. They examined his body themselves, looking for hidden armor, for Kevlar somehow concealed under a thin cotton shirt, for any rational explanation. They found nothing. One officer, frustrated, told Rajesh that what he was describing was impossible, and Rajesh agreed completely, nodding, saying yes, it should be impossible, it was impossible, and yet here he stood.
News of the incident spread faster than fire through dry grass. By evening, everyone within 20 miles knew some version of the story. Details varied. Numbers of shots increased in some tellings, decreased in others. But the core remained constant. A man was shot multiple times at point-blank range and lived without injury. House church leaders from the underground network heard the news and wept, calling it a sign that God hadn't forgotten them, that persecution wasn't the end of the story. Other religious leaders heard the news and denounced it as fabrication, as staged propaganda, as impossible because such miracles had ended centuries ago or had never existed at all. But the young man who'd pulled the trigger knew the truth. Sitting in a police cell, staring at his hands, he kept replaying those moments, kept feeling the gun kick with each shot, kept seeing Rajesh standing there untouched. He'd tried to kill a man and been stopped, not by police or intervention or bad aim, but by something else entirely. Something he couldn't name but could feel, like a wall made of nothing that held everything back. In the days that followed, he'd tell anyone who'd listen that the gun worked, that he knew how to shoot, that something had protected Rajesh. And slowly, almost against his will, he'd start asking questions about the God Rajesh believed in, the God who apparently could stop bullets without needing armor. What do you do with a miracle when you didn't ask for one? That's the question Rajesh wrestled with in the weeks that followed. Because here's the thing about surviving something impossible. Everyone wants a piece of it. Everyone wants you to perform it again, to prove it was real, to explain exactly how it felt and what you learned and what it means. People showed up at his house at all hours. Fellow believers wanting to touch him, to hear the story firsthand, to cry and praise and ask if he felt different now, if surviving changes you. Skeptics wanting to interrogate him, to find the flaw in his testimony, to explain away what couldn't be explained. Curious strangers wanting to see the man who'd cheated death, like he was a carnival attraction, instead of someone who'd simply been trying to sell vegetables and talk about what he believed. His wife watched him carefully during those weeks, noting how he'd startle at sudden sounds, how he'd stop mid-conversation and touch his chest, like he was checking to make sure he was still solid, still present. Trauma doesn't always look like nightmares and flashbacks. Sometimes it looks like a man who can't quite believe he exists, who keeps waiting for reality to correct itself, for those bullets to finally complete their trajectory. She held him at night when he'd wake up gasping, when his body remembered what his mind tried to process.
That moment of ultimate vulnerability, of seeing death approach and being unable to stop it, of surrendering to what should have been inevitable. But alongside the trauma, something else grew. A certainty, a bone-deep conviction that he hadn't been spared randomly, that this wasn't cosmic luck or quantum anomaly, but intentional intervention, that he'd been kept alive for a reason, even if that reason wasn't entirely clear yet. It changed how he talked about his faith. Before, he'd spoken with the enthusiasm of someone who'd discovered something wonderful and wanted to share it. Now he spoke with the authority of someone who'd tested that faith in the most extreme way possible and found it held, who'd literally stood in front of execution and been preserved. The local church, those small gatherings of believers who met in homes and basements and anywhere they wouldn't be noticed, struggled with how to interpret what had happened. On one hand, it was exactly the kind of miracle they prayed for, evidence that God still intervened, still protected, still demonstrated power in impossible situations. On the other hand, they knew that not everyone was protected this way. They lost people. They'd buried friends who'd been beaten, believers who'd been killed, families who'd been destroyed. Why was Rajesh preserved when others weren't? Did it mean their faith was weaker? Did it mean God had favorites? Or did it mean something more mysterious, that divine intervention followed logic humans couldn't quite grasp, that protection and persecution somehow coexisted in the same story without canceling each other out? An older pastor in the network, a man who'd been imprisoned 3 times for his faith, came to visit Rajesh about a month after the shooting. They sat on Rajesh's small concrete porch, drinking tea, watching the sun set in colors that turned the dust golden. The pastor didn't ask for details about what happened. He'd heard enough versions already. Instead, he asked Rajesh what he planned to do now. "Do I have a choice?" Rajesh asked. And the pastor smiled, sad, knowing expression. "There's always a choice," the pastor said. "You could take this as a sign to be quiet now, to keep your head down, to figure God's made his point and you should protect yourself and your family. No one would blame you. Or you could take this as a sign to speak louder, to use what happened as testimony, as evidence that God is real and active and protective. Both interpretations are valid. Both require faith." Rajesh was quiet for a long time, watching children play in the street, their laughter high and clear in the evening air. "I don't feel brave," he said finally. "I don't feel like someone who survived something miraculous. I feel confused and scared and like I'm supposed to understand something I don't quite grasp yet." "That's normal," the pastor said. "Miracles are disorienting. They break the rules we've learned about how the world works. They make us question what's possible. But here's what I've learned after decades of this. God's protection isn't always about removing us from danger. Sometimes it's about sustaining us through it. Sometimes the miracle isn't that we avoid suffering, but that we survive it, that we keep believing in the middle of it, that we don't let fear win." "What if they try again?" Rajesh asked, voicing the question that had haunted him since the moment he'd patted his chest and found no wounds. "What if next time the bullets work?" The pastor set down his teacup, chose his words carefully. "Then you will die, and that will also be part of the story. Not the end of it, but part of it. Because this was never really about you."
"Rajesh, I don't mean that cruelly. I mean that what happened to you became a sign for everyone who heard about it. It became evidence that our faith isn't wishful thinking or desperate coping. It became proof that when we pray for protection, sometimes, not always, but sometimes, God answers in ways that can't be explained away. Your life now carries that testimony whether you want it to or not." That conversation shifted something in Rajesh. He realized the pastor was right. This had become bigger than his personal survival. In a region where believers were told to be silent, where persecution was meant to intimidate them into invisibility, what had happened to Rajesh had become a kind of declaration, a statement that they served a God who could intervene, who could protect, who could make impossibilities possible. That didn't mean everyone would be protected the same way, but it meant the possibility existed,
And sometimes, possibility is enough to sustain hope. Slowly, carefully, Rajesh began speaking again. Not recklessly. He wasn't trying to provoke another attempt on his life, but intentionally. When people asked him what happened, he told them the truth. When they asked what he believed, he explained it clearly. When they asked if he was afraid, he admitted yes, constantly, but that fear didn't change what was true. He spoke in living rooms and back alleys and quiet corners of the market where he eventually returned to sell his vegetables. His wife supported him, though her hands shook whenever he left the house, though she prayed more desperately than ever for his safety and sanity. The young man who'd tried to kill Rajesh, his name was Ahmed, Rajesh eventually learned, had a harder journey. In the months following the shooting, he was released from police custody due to lack of injury to the victim, which made prosecution complicated. But what should have been relief felt more like exile. His friends avoided him, uncomfortable with the failure, with the implications. His family was embarrassed, caught between outrage that he'd tried to kill someone and confusion about why it hadn't worked. And Ahmed himself couldn't stop thinking about those moments, about pulling the trigger and watching nothing happen, about the impossibility he'd witnessed. He started asking questions. Quietly at first, indirectly, asking mutual acquaintances about Rajesh's beliefs, about what kind of God could stop bullets. The questions eventually led him to seek out Rajesh himself, a meeting that took weeks to arrange because neither man knew quite how to face the other. When they finally met in a neutral location with mediators present to ensure safety, Ahmed's first words were simple: "I don't understand what happened." Rajesh, looking at this young man who'd tried to end his life, felt something unexpected, not anger, but compassion. Because Ahmed had been confronted with the same impossibility Rajesh had experienced, just from the other side of the gun. "Neither do I," Rajesh admitted. "Not completely, but I know what I believe, that God protected me because He's not finished with my story yet. Maybe He's not finished with yours either." They talked for hours that first meeting, and many times after. Ahmed didn't convert overnight. Real transformation rarely happens quickly, but he stopped being certain about what he'd been certain about before. He started reading the texts Rajesh had read, started asking the questions Rajesh had asked, started wondering if the God who could stop bullets might be worth investigating. Some in both communities denounced this friendship, believers suspicious of Ahmed's motives, others outraged that Rajesh would associate with someone who tried to murder him. But Rajesh kept meeting with Ahmed, kept answering questions, kept embodying what he believed about forgiveness and grace and the possibility of redemption. About 6 months after the shooting, Ahmed made a decision that shocked everyone who knew him. He began openly exploring Rajesh's faith, attending small gatherings, asking to learn more. He didn't do it quietly or cautiously. He did it the same way he'd done everything else in his life, with intensity and commitment. This, of course, put him in the exact same danger Rajesh had faced. His family disowned him. His friends threatened him. The community that had once supported his attempted murder of Rajesh now turned that same hostility toward Ahmed himself. And Rajesh, who could have felt vindicated or satisfied watching his would-be killer face persecution, instead felt terrified for him. He understood now, in a way he hadn't before, what it cost to follow this path, what it required, what it risked. He tried to counsel Ahmed to be cautious, to count the cost, to understand what he was stepping into. But Ahmed just smiled. A sad, knowing expression that reminded Rajesh of the old pastor who'd visited him months earlier and said, "You survived bullets. If God can do that, He can handle whatever comes next." The story spread beyond their town, beyond their region, carried by house church networks and whispered testimonies, and eventually by social media and international prayer networks. People across the world began praying for Rajesh, for Ahmed, for the small community of believers trying to survive in a place where their faith was illegal and dangerous. Some heard the story and believed immediately. Others heard it and dismissed it as exaggeration, as legend, as the kind of tale that grows in the telling until truth becomes indistinguishable from mythology. But for those who were there, who saw the empty cartridges on the ground, who examined Rajesh's unmarked body, who witnessed a gun work perfectly except when it should have killed, the story remained undeniable. A marker in time that separated before from after, a moment when the ordinary rules of cause and effect were interrupted by something extraordinary. Whether you call it miracle or mystery or divine intervention doesn't change the fact that Rajesh stood in front of a gun that fired multiple times and walked away intact. Rajesh still sells vegetables at the market, though now people come as much to hear his story as to buy tomatoes. His wife still worries every time he leaves the house, still prays with an urgency that hasn't diminished despite months passing without another attempt. His children are growing up with a story about their father that will shape how they understand faith and risk and the possibility that God sometimes intervenes in ways that break natural laws. They live with both the gift and the burden of that story, the gift of a father who survived, the burden of wondering if divine protection is transferable, inheritable, or entirely situational.
Ahmed faces his own challenges, navigating persecution that's more complicated because he's a convert, because he betrayed his community, because he represents both attempted murder and miraculous survival in one complicated narrative. But he continues meeting with Rajesh, continues learning, continues asking questions that don't have easy answers. Together, they represent something profound, that enemies can become friends, that persecution can transform, that even in the darkest moments when death seems inevitable, there's the possibility of intervention, of redemption, of a story that doesn't end where everyone expected it to. The broader church in that region, that scattered underground network of believers who live with daily danger, holds Rajesh's story carefully. They tell it when faith wavers. They remember it when persecution intensifies. They use it as evidence that they're not alone, not forgotten, not abandoned to face danger without supernatural support. But they're also honest about the complexity, about the fact that many believers have been killed, that miracles don't happen every time, that faith sometimes requires enduring suffering rather than being delivered from it. And Rajesh himself? He's still processing what happened, still touching his chest sometimes to confirm he's solid, still waking up at night remembering the sound of gunshots and the impossible absence of pain, still wondering why he was protected when others weren't, still trying to figure out what it means to carry a testimony of divine intervention in a world where suffering and salvation coexist in confusing proximity. He doesn't have all the answers, doesn't claim to understand God's logic or methods, but he knows what he experienced, and he knows it changed him in ways he's still discovering. If you're watching this and wondering what to make of this story, I understand. It's a lot. It challenges comfortable categories about what's possible and what's not. It raises questions about why some people are protected and others aren't. It forces us to consider whether we believe in a God who still intervenes in impossible ways or whether we've domesticated our faith into something more manageable, more predictable, more easily explained. Those are uncomfortable questions, but maybe they're worth sitting with. Maybe they're worth discussing in the comments below. What does this story make you think about? What does it make you feel? What questions does it raise that you wish you could ask Rajesh or Ahmed directly? Because here's the thing about stories like this one. They're not just about what happened to one man in one market in one corner of the world. They're about what's possible, about whether the universe sometimes bends in response to prayer, whether love and faith and hope have any real power, whether protection is ever miraculous or always explainable. And those questions matter whether you believe in miracles or not because they shape how we understand reality, how we face danger, how we hold on to hope when circumstances suggest we shouldn't. Rajesh is still out there, still talking, still believing despite the risk. Ahmed is still learning, still asking questions, still navigating the complicated aftermath of trying to kill someone and then becoming intrigued by their God. The community around them is still fractured, some inspired by what happened, others threatened by it, many simply confused about what it means. And somewhere in that confusion, in that tension between danger and protection, persecution and miracle, that's where faith lives. Not in certainty, not in easy answers, but in the willingness to keep believing, even when bullets are fired, even when outcomes are uncertain, even when the story doesn't end the way you expected it to.
So what do you think? Does this story change how you think about divine protection, about persecution, about what's possible when faith confronts violence? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if this story moved you, if it made you think, if it stirred something in you that needs more exploration, consider subscribing so you don't miss the next one. Because the world is full of stories like Rajesh's, stories of impossible survival, of unexpected grace, of moments when the ordinary rules break down and something extraordinary pushes through. Stories that remind us we might not understand everything about how the universe works, but we can still pay attention to the moments when it works in ways that shouldn't be possible. Rajesh would want you to know that his story isn't really about him. It's about a God who still intervenes, still protects, still demonstrates power in impossible situations. Whether you believe that or not is up to you. But the empty cartridges still lie somewhere in evidence bags, testimony to bullets that were fired. And Rajesh still walks around with unmarked skin, testimony to bullets that somehow never arrived. However you explain that gap between what should have happened and what did, that gap exists, that impossible space where death was supposed to happen but didn't. And that gap is worth pondering, worth wrestling with, worth discussing with others who are trying to make sense of a world where suffering and salvation seem randomly distributed until you look closer and notice patterns that don't quite fit randomness. The international attention that eventually found Rajesh's story brought its own complications. Journalists wanted interviews. Documentary filmmakers wanted footage. Christian organizations wanted to feature his testimony at conferences and fundraising events. Rajesh found himself suddenly thrust into a spotlight he never sought, expected to be articulate and inspirational when mostly he just felt bewildered and grateful and deeply, persistently aware of his own mortality, despite having survived the unsurvivable. He turned down most of the requests, not because he wanted to hide what had happened, but because he recognized that spectacle could easily overshadow substance, that his story could become entertainment rather than testimony, that the miracle could be commodified until it lost its power to transform. He agreed to a few carefully selected interviews, always insisting that Ahmed's journey be included in the narrative, always emphasizing that this wasn't about him being special, but about God being faithful. But mostly he stayed in his town, kept selling vegetables, kept having quiet conversations with people who had questions about faith and fear and what happens when the two collide.